Hey there, welcome to dotnetFlix. Maurice de Beijer is here and we are talking about some cool new stuff in React. So last episode we've talked about hooks and now we are talking about suspense.
Suspense,
The suspense is killing me.
Yeah, that's a pretty good joke.
First time you heard it also.
No, never heard that before. Never.
It's a cool name. So
In fact, I
That's intriguing.
actually suggested a session for React Rotterdam where I named my title Suspense Not Just for Alfred Hitchcock, which I'm actually going to do in January.
Oh,
nice.
nice, cool.
But suspense, what's suspense?
Yeah, let's dive in.
So suspense is basically, to put it really simply, a way of suspending a component while it's rendering,
Okay.
which is kind of weird to think about it, but it actually makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of stuff in the typical web application which is asynchronous, like fetching data, things like that. And typically, as you could have seen in the previous video, and I'll show that again in a bit, you've got some state like we're loading or there's a potential error there, and do something with the loading state, do something with the error state, or we're finished loading successfully, then we actually process the data.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the same code that comes up every time when you're doing asynchronous work in the components. And it's kind of like, well, can't we do that easier?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the React team's been working on that quite a bit, and it turns out we can.
Cool.
Now, caveat, most of what I'm going to show in this demo is not production ready.
Okay.
So the first bit that's released and available, but then we're going to venture into future stuff. And in fact, let me show you something before I actually go somewhere else. In the package.json, you can see here the React version I'm using is, well, 0.0.0, which doesn't really
It's
mean a
always
lot,
good.
but it says experimental.
Yeah. So it's not even beta or alpha
It's,
or
no, what the React team used to do is just have the preview bits in the regular builds. So you would install React 16.10 or something, and then you would be able to import unstable features. Well, they've stopped doing that a while ago. Now they have a special feed with experimental builds, and there's actually pretty much a nightly build as well if you really want to be on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
But this experimental version kind of has those new features in there. But it turns out at the end I'll still be using the unstable prefixes for some of the stuff which isn't even completely experimental yet, but even further in the future.
Okay.
So be careful with that. By the time this is production ready, it's probably going to be somewhat different.
Yeah.
So
And that will be 2020 timeframe somewhere, or is it not clear yet?
don't know. Some of it will be, some of it is probably going to be further in the future. In fact, asynchronous rendering, which is the last bit I'm going to show, is something the React team has been working on for several years already.
Okay.
Oh,
It's a pretty big rewrite of how React works internally, so not a trivial change. So if that's actually going to be available in 2020, I don't know. It could very well be 2021.
Okay.
That said, I do know React is using, or Facebook is using it on the Facebook website, so they're actually testing this on their own stuff in production.
Okay.
So, but first let's start with something which is available. Just to illustrate the problem, I've got a little checkbox here, and in there I toggle this display jokes state, which is done with React.useState up here. And then I've got a little jokes component, but I'm only rendering that if display jokes is truthy.
Okay. And,
So-
and that React.useState, that is a hook that we talked about in the previous video. So
Yeah, correct.
Cool.
So this is a functional component with a hook there.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of this demo, that doesn't actually even matter. It could
know,
have been a class-based component. The important bit is I'm only using that jokes component when display jokes is true. Otherwise, I'm not using it. So right here, let me refresh this. You see, I load up the page and it's pretty simple. And all I've got here is checkbox. But until I check it, that jokes component is never rendered.
Yeah.
Now, let me open the DevTools, and we'll go to Network, and let me refresh this. And I'll clear, and I'll check it again, so we can see what's going on with the network. You see, the only thing that's happening is we're loading John Skeet.json, which is the actual data of those jokes.
Yep.
You know, the jokes about John Skeet on Stack Overflow, etc. Well, that means that the code for this component is actually loaded when the application loaded.
Yep.
Now, in this case, that's not so bad because it's a tiny demo application, big deal. But assume you've got a big single-page application, there is a big admin section.
Yep.
Most users are not going to go there because they're not admins. Still, all of that code gets loaded up when the application starts.
That's not optimal.
And no, that's wasteful because even if the user is an admin, he's probably not going to go there, and most users won't anyway. So wouldn't it be much better if we could defer loading the code until we actually need it?
Oh.
Well, turns out we can. We can change this joke component, well, not actually the joke component itself, but how we're using it in such a way that it's only fetched when it's needed.
Okay.
So it's automatically split up into a different JavaScript bundle, and that bundle is not loaded until it's actually needed.
Nice.
So let's do that. Wrong hotkey. So I'll comment out the jokes component. If my script wants to run, we'll load it using something called React.lazy. And React.lazy is basically a little wrapper component. And it says, well, if you render, then go and actually fetch that bundle. But until you render, don't bother.
Okay.
So let's first see it in action, then I'll explain more about it. So let's clear this console again. So we're kind of in the same state before. Now I click display jokes, and you see there are two requests being done.
Yeah.
2.chunk.js, which is the actual JavaScript which contains that component and all the stuff that would be imported from there.
Yeah.
And of course the data. Now that's only loaded once. If I uncheck display jokes, check it again, you see that John Skeet.json is loaded again, but the JavaScript chunk isn't.
Exactly.
The first
So it's
time,
been cached.
the first time it's required, then it's okay, let's go and load it.
And is this chunking, is this done runtime, or is this something that the compiler transpiler does?
Yeah, that's done by the transpiler,
Okay.
like actually by the bundler to be more exact. This uses Webpack behind the scenes, and Webpack actually splits the code into different bundles.
Cool.
But I didn't have to write any Webpack configuration. Like I've got a create React app based application, no changes whatsoever to that. Really the only change is instead of importing jokes directly, which would include it in the main bundle, use React.lazy and use the import function in there to lazily load it.
Nice.
Now I did have to make a few more changes in order to get that to work in here. This suspense component, which is imported at the top here from React, was added, which has a fallback, which is a loading spinner.
Yeah.
So that loading spinner shows while something is being loaded.
Yep.
And we can kind of demonstrate that. Let me refresh this and we'll clear this again, and I'll set this to mimic a slow 3G network. So if I click display jokes, you kind of see that spinner while it's loading, and then when it's actually done, does it disappear.
Cool.
But you could briefly see that spinner disappear when the component was loaded, it rendered the component started fetching data, and the spinner reappeared again.
Yep.
So that's available today. All of that's perfectly usable and will work just fine. But if we go into the jokes component, we're kind of in the old-fashioned, but in the world we had before. We have a custom hook here, like we showed in the previous code, which, let's just open it for a moment there. It just has some state management in there, it has a loading state, etc. Again, simplified, no error management, but that would typically be there as well. So we get the data, we check whether we actually have data, if not, we display a loading spinner. Typically you'd need to have some error handling here, and all of that. And that's kind of like, can't we do this simpler? Well, we can, but this is the part where we get into future stuff.
Yeah.
So what the React team came up with is, well, if we can start treating these pieces of data not so much as URLs to fetch, but as asynchronous resources. And we can just read a resource here inside of a component, but that resource could actually suspend that component from like, I'm getting data, I'm not there yet, but I will be in a moment, and then we can continue rendering the component, which is kind of interesting. So let's do that. So the first thing we need to do is create a helper function, so create resource. And that's going to take some callback function which returns a promise. So what do you normally do with a promise? Well, you wait for that to resolve. In the case of resource, that's actually going to be slightly different. We're going to do something really weird. We're going to throw a promise.
Okay.
Which sounds really strange. But we're going to throw a promise if we're still waiting for it. So React renders our component. So React will actually catch and then check whether it catches is a promise or an error. If it's a promise, it knows about, okay, the component is suspended. It falls back to that same suspense component we were using just now. And shows that spinner or that fallback or whatever that may be. In this case, it's a spinner. If there is an error, we throw an error. So the normal behavior would throw.
Yeah.
And if we have a result, we just return the result.
I love the JavaScript world. Let's throw promises and catch errors. Yeah, it's weird.
So here, let's actually start up here. We've got that function here, being the load function being passed in. So we've got an internal function execute load, which just basically does async await over that load and sets the result. So that returns a promise because it's asynchronous. So if we don't have any result yet, it's still undefined, and we don't have an error, we actually throw this promise.
Okay.
Like I said, it's weird. Don't think about this. This
because
is boilerplate.
We can.
Yeah, because we can. And this is boilerplate code. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Production version would be more complex, more error resistant. But it's kind of a boilerplate you write once and probably get from some kind of separate NPM package, so you don't typically write this yourself.
Okay.
But that's the throw of the promise, that's the throw of the error, and that's when everything went fine and we actually have the result.
Yeah.
So with that create resource, we need to actually create a jokes resource.
Yep.
So we'll import create resource. We'll define a jokes resource, which basically means call create resource with the same code we had before. Go and fetch that JSON file and extract JSON from it, etc. Nothing special here. Again, slightly simplified, no error management or anything, but let's ignore that. So this is code you would write in your application.
Yeah.
Nothing strange here. No, the fact that the promise is thrown is not visible at all. That's just an internal implementation detail. So how do we actually use that? Well, we go to our jokes component and we import that resource. And instead of using that hook, we just say jokes resource.read. In this case, it's called read because that's the function I implemented.
Yeah.
And that's all there is to it.
Nice.
So now if I go back to my components, and we're still on slow 3G, so let's switch back to online. Behavior is exactly the same as before.
Nice.
The only slight difference here is because I'm actually caching the data inside the component, inside the resource, you see that the John Skeetle JSON is loaded only once.
Yeah.
But that's just an implementation.
Yeah.
Well, depends on your use case.
For this kind of data it is, but
if it's customer data or order data which is changing, you probably want to refetch it. But that's just a matter of how this create resource is implemented.
Yeah.
This is pretty simple. It's just like if we ever retrieve this resource, we're just going to return it again.
Yeah.
Just put in this is the actual read function we were calling. So just put another function in here to invalidate or check when it was loaded. So if it's loaded more than a minute ago, refetch, stuff like that.
Yep.
Like, it's just a matter of I return an object here, and inside that joke component, that's not readable. This jokes resource is that actual object I returned. Right now it only has a read function.
Yep.
Do whatever you want in there.
Nice.
So my component's actually simpler, because I don't have to do anything about maintaining states from when it was actually loading data and stuff like that. All of that's gone. So what happens when it's loading data? Well, it falls back to
Basically
the
goes all
same
the way up.
suspense component.
Yep.
Now I could have put a suspense component in there as well. It's like you can nest those as much as you want, so you can decide what to show, what not to show. And there's actually a newer suspense list component where you can start combining different suspenses, etc. So lots of flexibility.
Yep.
How about errors? Well, what's the normal way in React to do error handling? You create an error boundary.
Yes, and we wait for errors now, right? So we throw promises and wait for errors.
No, we also throw
Yeah,
errors.
I know. Just to get this.
You just wait for the error to resolve.
Yeah, but I don't actually have any error management in here. I don't have an error boundary, but I could just add an error boundary would catch render errors or lifecycle errors from React, but it would also catch an error showing in that resource.
Yeah.
So error management is not something different you have to add to every component. It works in the standard way.
Yeah.
So much nicer.
Nice.
So this is kind of useful at the moment. You can kind of do that. It's just like this create resource is not something which the React ships. In fact, React is probably never going to ship this. This is something which other libraries ship.
Yeah.
Implementations will probably be quite a bit more complex than this, but this is the basic gist of how they would work. As far as I'm aware, there are not really solid implementations at the moment yet, but there are quite a few data fetching libraries which are experimenting with this. And I know Facebook is using this in production as well at the moment, where Relay is one of those GraphQL libraries from Facebook, and they're using this quite extensively.
Okay.
So that implementation is probably quite good.
Yeah.
Although I haven't actually looked at the implementation. So let's go further into the future. That's
More experimental.
Yeah, because this is sort of experimental, but other than that resource, which they don't ship anyway, the suspense component is perfectly useful.
Yeah.
So throwing promises, that's perfectly doable.
Yeah.
I could have done this with the currently shipping version of React.
Yeah.
I did not need the experimental version for this. But asynchronous rendering is. Now, why do we want to do asynchronous rendering? And let me actually close this for a moment and let me go to this demo. So this isn't a demo I made, but this is a demo the React team made for to show why you would want to do asynchronous rendering. And kind of the trick is, if I start typing into this input, you'll see the number of dots and bars here in these graphs, you'll see them update.
Okay.
And the longer my inputs, the slower they're going to get, because there's more data being rendered. So if I start typing, you can see there are some delays, but if I don't type too fast, it sort of works until my string gets kind of long.
Yeah.
So I was typing, here I'm typing again, you don't see any updates. And this is with synchronous rendering, that's kind of what we have today. So, now, the traditional way to fix performance problems like this is to use something called debouncing. So you kind of trap events as they happen and only trigger updates of the rest of your application periodically.
Okay.
Like if you stop typing, with debounces typically say after half a second, if you stop typing for half a second. Yeah. Or you can do something with, say, throttle, where you can do, well, at most every half second or so.
Oh.
So that works, but if I type, it's remains nice and responsive, but you also see those graphs don't update until I stop typing. As long as I keep typing slowly, no updates at all.
Yeah.
So even if there are very few characters, like this would have rendered fast enough, it still doesn't.
Yeah.
So kind of works, but it's not perfect.
You basically want the best of both of these worlds.
And that's what asynchronous rendering is going to give us. Because now I can start typing and you can see it renders immediately because there is enough time to do so. But when my input gets longer, let me keep on typing, you see it stays responsive, but there's actually updates being dropped here.
Yeah.
And we can see that with this little utility. So green means that everything is great and being updated, but you can see if I type that it becomes slightly slower.
Yeah.
Well, let's do the same with synchronous.
Yeah, it's lagging behind.
See the big red area? That's kind of like it takes too long.
Yeah.
Now in an ideal world you want to keep the time a render takes under like 60 milliseconds. So that's 60 milliseconds boils down to 60 frames per second.
Yeah.
But in this case rendering just takes too long, so frames are dropped and the whole application becomes slow.
Yep. And then users will leave your site.
If they've got a choice, like if you're doing a business application in-house, then users are pretty much forced to use your application. So
but
you might not need to worry. They'll get mad at you and you won't have a lot of goodwill. Yeah. But especially if you're doing public facing stuff for, like Facebook themselves is, this is a big problem.
Exactly.
Like if the Facebook website is really slow, then people are going to be more annoyed with Facebook and might switch to competitors. Yeah. So bigger complex applications suffer more from this problem than small ones. But the nice thing is anyone will benefit from these things being built into React.
Yep.
So let's do that. Now the first thing you need to do is make sure that your application is compatible with asynchronous rendering. And there is this strict mode component. And you can use that at the moment. Well, it doesn't really make your application faster, but it will start checking your application for a number of bad practices, a number of lifecycle functions which you shouldn't use, like component will mounts, component will update, and it will basically give you warnings for that. Now, I shouldn't have any warnings, at least I hope I don't. Let's double check. No, nothing. Like otherwise they'll show up here in the console. Yeah. But that's kind of the first thing you have to do. And you can do that today even if you're not using asynchronous rendering yet. It's kind of prepare for the future. Wrong key, this one. So the next thing to actually start using asynchronous rendering is instead of using the normal React DOM.render, where you say render this application into this DOM node, the root node, we're going to create a root and use that React DOM root to actually render the application. Okay. So just in case you're wondering about the exclamation mark, that's because getElementById could potentially return a null if root doesn't exist, and create root is typed as always wanting an element or fragment, not accepting the null version, and React DOM.render doesn't actually check on that. It would at runtime, but the type checkings don't. So now my application still works. Let me refresh that for a moment. I can still toggle and everything seems fine. Turns out it isn't though. Let me refresh and then open the console again. No errors, but if I click display jokes, you see this error. Application triggered to user blocking updates. Now you might see this, you might not. That depends on how your application is structured. In this case this appears because I'm doing asynchronous loading of the jokes component, and as soon as that started loading it blocks again because I'm using the resource to load the actual jokes. So it's block, resume block, and it doesn't like that.
Okay.
It suspends while it's resuming. It's going to function fine. It's, well, fine-ish. The application still runs, but you do get this error, and it is an indication that something is wrong. They don't print this error for
This
nothing.
could potentially become a performance issue. Or
Yeah, it could potentially break something or become slower.
Yeah.
So, in order to fix that, we need to change things a bit. And just to go back to my application code, right now, basically here on changed for the input, I'm just updating the states.
Yeah.
Toggle display jokes to true, at least initially it goes from false to true, which means that that jokes component is rendered.
Yeah.
Well, if we just do it this way, that's pretty much immediate, a high priority thing, which is usually fine, but that's actually causing the issue now. So what I want to do is instead import something from the scheduler, and the scheduler is sort of internal React package. It's a separate NPM package, but you typically don't see it, and use one of the functions in there. And here you can actually still see that unstable underscore next. So unstable underscore means that this is preview.
Yeah. Pretty obvious.
Yeah. In this case, with the scheduler, they're not releasing one of those experimental version packages yet. So in the package.json, it's still a regular one. But by using that next function, I'm basically saying, okay, instead of changing the state directly, schedule a state change for me with a lower priority. So that whole suspend, resume, suspend cycle is broken into distinct parts.
Okay.
So function is the same, no errors anymore.
Yeah.
Nice.
Now there are a whole bunch of functions you could use from the scheduler. Whether this will actually work this way when it's released, I'm not sure. I suspect it will change. I suspect they'll have a nicer API for it, but it will basically do the same under the hood. So with next, it's basically scheduled as a normal priority item. There is also a schedule function there where you can actually specify the priority. So you could say, schedule this with high priority or with normal priority, low, or even something like schedule this, but if you're busy and you never get around to it, that's actually fine as well. I don't care. So it's really low priority.
Also, again, really granular control for the developer.
Yeah.
Cool.
But like I said, all of that's really experimental. I would not recommend trying this in a production application yet, but it is available and it's fun to play around with. How this is going to pan out in production by the time this is released and when this is released.
Yeah. No ETAs yet.
No.
Just keep an eye on the documentation and the repos.
This isn't documented yet, but quite a lot of the other stuff is documented.
Okay.
How suspense works, how asynchronous rendering works, all of that's documented. As far as I know, there's no documentation on the scheduler and stuff like that. I basically reverse engineered this from Facebook demos and by looking at the source code, etc. Yeah. It's like most people are not even aware that there is this thing called scheduler and that it's part of the React repo.
Yeah. Cool.
So,
nice.
Look into the future of rendering of React. Well, the first part's not the future, but this is very much the future.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I hope you like it also. We're learning all about React Suspense. And maybe see you the next time on dotnetFlix. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.